Anyway, before we get into the Federal Reserve, I just want to show you how big a hole we're actually in. And using publicly available figures, I prepared this little chart here. Everybody see that okay? I'll move it up as we go down the page here so you can see the bottom better. But if we take a look at the things that are not in the current year budget that have been added to federal expenditures since last October 1st when the budget year flipped. Thank you. First you got the Bankster bailout, 850, stimulus package 787, omnibus spending bill 410. That's over $2 trillion right there, over and above George Bush's last $3.1 trillion budget. Now, is there anybody here who really thinks that this year's budget deficit is going to be smaller than last year's? It's a joke, right? So to that, we have to add at least last year's deficit of $432 billion. And I consider this number here that I came up with to be the absolute minimum deficit that we're going to be faced with this year. Almost $2.5 trillion. Now you throw in the fact that the year is not over with yet and there's a lot of damage yet to be done. You throw in the fact that Timmy Geithner's already rattling the cage for another $2 trillion to bail out the banks again. It is far, far more likely that we're going to have a deficit this 1 year in excess of $3 trillion than anything at all under $2 trillion. And again, these are all publicly available figures. I didn't make them up. I don't know why the media is saying 1.8 trillion when the evidence is pretty clear it's going to be far higher than that. So, I might as well theme this section here. Let's borrow from our friends on the left. Be afraid. Be very, very afraid. All right. Here's something else I came up with. The real cost of government. And I got this off most of this information comes from the Americans for Tax Reform. I think that's Grover Norquist's group. And he states that all taxes, direct and indirect, sales tax, income tax, fees, licenses, we pay 36% of gross domestic product in taxes and fees to our government, state, federal, and local. But on top of that, you have to hire an accountant if you're anything but a peanut business. And a lot of people do to fill out their 1040s and, the list goes on, all these, plus every business has a whole bunch of rules and regulations that have to be complied with. The cost of this compliance is another 18%. So the effective cost of government, COG is how I'm going to refer to that later for abbreviations, is 54%. And I went backwards. I have the total expenditure, so I multiplied that 54% times last year's gross domestic product of 14 trillion. 7.56 trillion is the approximate cost of all of our governments last year. And I'm assuming that there's going to be a 15% drop in GDP. Does that sound reasonable? I think it's reasonable to say that this year's economy is going to be at least 15% less. So on the basis of that 12%, this year's cost of government is 63%. Well, that's actually what we're paying. It doesn't include another 17%, that $2 trillion that was added, remember? So our real cost of government this year is 9.56 out of $12 trillion, almost 80%. Is that sustainable? I think not. I think the question answers itself. Long-term prospects. According to David M. Walker, who's the former Comptroller General of the United States of America, he's been on what he calls a fiscal reality tour. Anybody heard of that? Anybody gone to one? Or seen it on the net? Yeah, it's a shame. I wish everybody in America saw his fiscal reality tours. But he is saying that our unfunded liabilities are such that our real debt, if we figure it on an accrual basis, most big businesses have to use an accrual basis. It kind of works like this. I'm in the building business. If one of you people gives me a $50,000 down payment on a good-sized house in December, but I don't start building it until January of the next year, my income is not really $50,000 extra that year. here because I haven't offset it with any expenses. Accrual takes the expenses and the income and puts them together in the same time frame. So anyway, if we take the unfunded liabilities, and a lot of that assumes an interest rate, something like what we have right now, our real debt is like $56 trillion, not the 11 trillion that we're being told right now. Other people, other economists, the chairman of the Fed for Dallas says it's closer to 100 or 120 trillion. But let's use Mr. Walker's more conservative figures here. How's that ever going to be paid? Walker points to three ways, and I've added one on the bottom. First is we can grow the economy at better than 10% a year. This does not happen in a mature industrial economy. It might happen in Southeast Asia 10 or 15 years ago when they were rapidly industrializing. But typically, in a mature economy, the growth rate is on the order of, the real growth rate is on the order of 2 or 3% per year. So throw that one out the window, it's not going to happen. The other thing we can do is double the tax rate. And even using the older numbers of 36%, that means we're going to have 72% tax rates. And as I'm about to show, that's not tenable either over the long haul. And then the third thing is we can cut government expenses right now by 60%. Now, what are the chances of convincing Obama and company of doing that today? Not real good. So, short-term prospects are not real, they're pretty bleak in my opinion. And remember, a lot of these figures are pre-meltdown, you know, before we had this financial crisis here a few months ago.
But you didn't go into your fourth contribution.
Oh, my fourth contribution is, thank you, Ben. The only other way that I can see that it's going to be paid is through inflation. The government, or actually the Federal Reserve, is going to create dollars, but what's that going to do to the dollars that you hold in your pocket? It's going to diminish their value. And Ron Paul, who happens to be one of my heroes, he calls this the inflation tax. It's an insidious tax that hurts the middle class and the poorer folks in an economy worse than it does the upper class and the extremely wealthy. You know, if you have a certain amount of disposable income, you're able to invest, and you might have the economic sophistication to invest in inflation hedges. But if you're living paycheck to paycheck, what are your options? Not much. So, before we kill this horse altogether, I'm just going to go through this real quick. Current cost of government, 63%, even discounting the 17 that we had to borrow. Double the taxes, 36%. Fully socialized medicine is going to add, I think, a semi-educated guess, 10% of the cost of our economy. You're coming to 109%. And there's different permutations you can use with these basically publicly available figures that paint the picture even worse than that. Now remember, I don't have that 17% in there. If we had that, we're at 126%. How do you spend 126% of your gross domestic product? The only way to do that is to dig a deep, deep debt hole. So again, short term, that's what we got to do. But you know, long term, what's going to happen is more and more people are going to see the truth in what we just talked about here. More and more people are going to wake up, and I think we'll have an opportunity to make a difference.